So welcome everybody to tonight's panel in conversation about inclusive writing. I am your moderator, Tien Nguyen. I'm a freelance science journalist and the vice president of DCSWA. So a few sort of housekeeping things while we're waiting for people to come in. As you can see, we have our code of conduct up on the screen right now, and I just wanted to remind everybody to please be thoughtful and respectful in your questions and in the chat. If we'll be monitoring the chat for questions, and anyone who doesn't comply with our code of conduct will be asked to stop, and Sam will be monitoring, and we may ask you to leave. So I should introduce our co-host, Sam Jones, who is a science writer at the American Chemical Society and a board member for DCSWA. So now on to tonight's topic. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second, so I can pull up my notes. So our topic tonight is inclusive writing. And as science writers and communicators, we're entrusted with much more than just explaining scientific facts. We're also writing about the scientists who do the work and how their science affects our lives and our communities. So to do so with respect and precision, particularly when writing about groups that have been historically marginalized, it's really important that we carefully consider our words and their impact. And so I'm excited to be in conversation about inclusive writing tonight with our wonderful panel. And with that, I'd like to ask our panelists to each introduce themselves. So again, why don't we go in alphabetical order? Ebony, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Ebonye Gussine Wilkins, and I am a social justice writer, editor, and media activist, and the CEO of Inclusive Media Solutions, LLC.
Thank you. Kate?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kate. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a poet, essayist, and freelance journalist, as well as a senior science writer at Palladian Partners in Silver Spring. I see a very solid Palladian contingent here tonight. So hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm also disabled and chronically ill, and I write and teach about both those topics.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm DeAndre, miles-hercules. I use they, them pronouns. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I also do consulting on issues of language, race, social justice, that sort of thing.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So I've asked each of our panelists tonight to speak about one aspect of inclusive writing. I mean, this topic is so broad, we could talk about this for many hours, but just to keep things focused, I thought we would each have them speak for about 10 minutes, and then I will lead a discussion. I will have a few questions, and then we'll go to audience questions. So again, I will pass it over to one of our panelists, and we'll go in alphabetical order. And so Ebony, you're up first.
Thank you very much. So again, my name is Ebony, and today I want to talk to you about restorative justice for human subjects through inclusive writing. So let's talk about science. We're looking to gain knowledge. That's the reason why we do this work in the first place. And so I want to, for a second, put on the lens of pursuing knowledge. And everything inside the circle is essential to doing that. And everything that you will see outside of the circle is a sometimes thing. Sometimes you need it, sometimes you don't. So in the pursuit of knowledge through science, you need researchers and scientists. You can't do the work without them. You'll also need tools, materials, equipment. You'll need to document your findings and experimentation. Things that you need sometimes are human subjects, a commitment to integrity if you actually want to be a decent scientist. You need to have an idea of where it can go wrong, and you need to know what you're doing. And the reason why I say you need to know what you're doing is a sometimes thing is because we have a lot of happy little accidents in science sometimes, and we learn a lot from that. So for a second, let us switch the lens to something else. We're still talking science, but we're just switching the lens from the pursuit of knowledge. Let's talk about the circle of human concern. When you're doing science, you still need the researchers and the scientists, but you also need ethics and protocols and humanity. You also need human subjects, a commitment to integrity, knowing where things can go wrong and knowing what you're doing. But as you can see here, human subjects, among other things, are outside the circle of human concern. They should all be inside the circle, in case that wasn't clear. I mean, that's why we have the IRB, right? Because people have done really terrible things over the years, and it's all been well documented because that's what scientists do, right? But the needs and the autonomy of human subjects are not always honored, even with the IRB. So one of the issues, there's three that I've noted. One of the issues is that science and institutions don't always contend with the past. Sometimes when they do, it's on the later side. If we go back to 1951 with Henrietta Lacks and Dr. George Gray, her cells were taken without her notice, as you all know, and they're still being used today. Her family didn't find out for over 20 years after her death. This is not okay. If you jump to 1966, we have David Reimer and Dr. John Money. This and the previous study were both at Johns Hopkins University. And the situation was there were newborn identical twins, there was a botched circumcision, and the parents went to Dr. John Money for help. And this was the start of the first gender reassignment surgery. It did not go well. It caused a lifetime of trauma for David Reimer, and it's just all kinds of ethical, not even gray areas. They're just terrible, terrible things. One of the other issues, people are dehumanized in the name of science. If you want to talk about the Tuskegee syphilis study from the 1930s to the 1970s, that was a terrible thing. So was the sterilization of Native women, African American women, and Puerto Rican women. And it doesn't even end there. And these were all at different periods of time, some before the IRB and some after. The third issue is downplaying the importance of human subjects by elevating the pursuit of the greater good. So one thing that's still happening is the so-called debate between medically futile and if someone's life is worth living. Scientists and researchers and doctors should not be the ones to decide whose life is worth living. And this happens to people with disabilities all the time, especially in the COVID-19 world. What's also still happening is marginalized populations are not trusting that they'll be treated ethically and humanely. In the pursuit of a vaccine for COVID-19, scientists are really worried that they don't have proportionate numbers of Blacks and Latinos and Latinx people to do this work. And I mean, they have every reason not to trust the establishment. So what does more inclusive writing look like? You should be asking yourself three questions. Is the framing appropriate? Are you thinking critically about the justifications for the decisions that have been made? And are you willing to set the record straight for the future? So what can we do now? One really important thing is to push back on editing and revisions that reinforce longstanding approaches to prioritizing science over people. Sometimes editors do not know all the things, and that's important to know. And sometimes the writer is the expert and the writer knows better. As a writer, you have a responsibility to make sure that your writing has the integrity of saying what you actually mean to say and doing it well. You should also pay attention to how the wording shapes the narrative. For example, with the case of David Reimer and Dr. John Money, one of the reasons why he thought it was okay is because he figured since they were identical twin boys, that it was an ideal subject because you have a control and you have, someone who's not a control. That's not okay. They're still people. And you need to find the truth and put it in context for the reader. And what that means is sometimes people can cherry pick what the facts are to make a point. And it's really important to really understand what you're trying to say and make sure that it's being said with all of the full information so that people can get the full picture. Remember, the stakes are just far too high to assume that readers will just know. There are a lot of things that, we don't find out for a long time, especially the public. So you do have the responsibility to tell the truth and put it in context. But you also have to remember that you are uniquely positioned to do this work as science writers, and your words will make a difference. So please choose them wisely.
Thank you very much, Ebony. Wonderful. Well, you've given us a lot to think about, so I will let's take a breath, and then we'll go on to our next speaker, Kate Horowitz. And let me pull up your slides.
Thank you. And Ebony, thank you for that. You just caught me. I was just taking notes instead of preparing for my own presentation. So thank you so much. That was wonderful. So Dan's going to pull up my slides. Perfect. Thank you. I wanted to make one quick note. My illness is worsened by heat and humidity, which means worse symptoms in the summer. One of those symptoms is brain fog, which is a form of cognitive dysfunction. So I will be reading from my notes tonight rather than trying to remember anything. This is an adaptation to accommodate a disability. And I'm pointing this out because I want to have us thinking about journalism and journalism culture and our ideas about what's acceptable and what's professional. Next slide, please. Thank you. A disability can be physical, mental, or developmental. It could be genetic or acquired later in life, and it can be visible or invisible. My disabilities, most of the time, are invisible. Most disabilities are invisible. Again, most disabilities are not visible. You cannot tell whether someone is disabled just by looking at them. Next slide, please. A chronic illness is an ongoing medical condition that's usually incurable. It may or may not affect an individual's quality of life, and it may or may not lead to disability. Many chronic illnesses can be treated, but this does not mean that all people with chronic illness can access treatment or even get diagnosed. Next slide, please. Thank you. Ableism is discrimination against or oppression of disabled people. It's not just unkindness or insensitivity. It's the enactment of an unjust power dynamic that privileges one kind of person over another. Ableism dehumanizes disabled people. And when we stop thinking about people as people, it's much easier to overlook them, mistreat them, and erase them. Ableist language and messages have been used throughout history to justify violence against disabled people, and it's still happening. Disabled people encounter ableism every single day. Every person does. But journalists have influence and an opportunity, and therefore a responsibility, to lead by example and to do better. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to talk very briefly about some of the ways that ableism manifests. Next slide, please. Overt ableism is discrimination against people because of their disabilities. Some examples in journalism include mentioning or describing someone's disability, especially as a negative, when it's not relevant to the story. This year, coverage of COVID-19 has stressed that the disease, especially the early coverage, has stressed that this disease is not a real threat because only disabled people and the elderly are dying. Another common example is attributing gun violence or hate crimes to mental illness. People with mental illness and other disabilities are far more likely to be victims than perpetrators of violence, especially at the hands of police. This is especially true for Black disabled people. Next slide, please. Here's a basic test. If a word, a term, or a message demeans somebody's body, their intelligence, or their mental health, it's ableist. Next slide, please. Casual ableism equates disability with negative qualities, and it perpetuates stereotypes, stigma, and oppression. If a word or a phrase uses disability as shorthand for something negative, and you aren't actually talking about that disability, that's ableism. Some examples include, he was blind to something, that fell on deaf ears, there's a crippling debt, that's lame. I want to offer a content warning here. The next slide contains some examples of ableist language. Some that are included are considered slurs. If you find that you're sensitive to this sort of thing, you can just avert your eyes until the slide is over. All right, next slide, please. Some of these terms may seem obvious, and others, probably the ones that we use the most often, may be more surprising. All of them are ableist. It is true that these words are used, many of these words are used so frequently and in so many contexts that they've drifted from their original definitions. But that doesn't mean that they've lost their power or that it's harmless to use them. Some of these words were at one time enshrined in laws and used to identify who could or should be legally imprisoned or sterilized or killed. And all of these terms are still used to justify the mistreatment of disabled people. All right, next slide. Thank you. It's safe to open your eyes now. Structural ableism. These are systems, institutions, infrastructures that discriminate, whether intentionally or unintentionally, against disabled people. Some examples relevant to science journalism. Reporters may require their sources to speak in person or on the telephone. Editors assign stories about disability and chronic illness to abled writers. Speaking institutionally, disabled and chronically ill people are up against inaccessible newsrooms and conferences and webinars and events and websites and inaccessible journalistic norms, like expecting somebody to be able to stand or memorize something in order to present. We've all also encountered those very confusingly discriminatory job postings that claim that somebody like a writer has to be able to perform physical tasks like lifting 10 pounds or walking. On social media, we find images without captions or image descriptions or alt text. All of these are needed for people who use screen readers. And then there are videos, including TikToks and other social media posts without closed captions or image descriptions. Next slide, please. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some things, as much time with that disability is not a tragedy. Many people are proud to be disabled and they do not want a cure. So where you can, avoid value judgments like she is a victim of, or she suffers from, she is confined to, or bound. Many people who use wheelchairs and other mobility devices find that these provide freedom, not take it away. When it's relevant to your story, try saying has, or is, or uses. Like she has muscular dystrophy, she uses a wheelchair. Next slide, please. I want to pause here and make a note on person first versus identity first language. Some of you may have heard a little bit about this. and I think all of us have encountered it in some form or another. I am a disabled person. This is identity first language. I am a person with a disability. This is person first language. And which one is correct depends on who's saying it. Many educators and communicators have been taught to use person first language, person with a disability, when describing disabled people. And this is supposed to humanize disabled people and remind listeners that we are people first, disabled second. But many, not all, but many disabled people disagree and use identity first language to describe themselves. So the only way to know which phrasing to use is to ask. A disabled person can refer to herself however she likes. A second party speaker describing this person should ask her what she prefers. When you're referring in the abstract to a group of people, you should check style guides and your organization's materials where that's applicable. And as Ebony said, if you feel like your style guide is out of date, speak up. Share resources with your editor. These things aren't going to change unless we change them. Next slide, please. Thank you. Like any other group, disabled people are not a monolith. Some people use identity first language, some use person first, some people are cool with either. Some people don't mind or even prefer euphemisms. But disabled people are the experts on their own identities. Never correct somebody who's talking about themselves. Never say, no, you are a person with a disability. You need to respect each person's preferences and identities. Some people characterize their experience with disability or illness as suffering, and some people don't. Some people are proud to be disabled, and some people are not. Some people publicly identify as disabled, and some people don't. Some people have reclaimed some of those slurs that we saw and carry them with pride. But this does not mean that you should use these terms if you don't share this identity. Next slide, please. None of these rules, almost none of these rules are universal, and nobody out there is going to get this right 100% of the time. I definitely don't. Just do your best, use good sense, start to question some of your assumptions, and treat people with respect and humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Wonderful. All right, so I will move on to our next speaker. DeAndre, I'll hand it over to you.
Me, I'll go ahead and share my screen. And here we go. Perfect. So again, I'm DeAndre miles-hercules. I'm at UCSB Linguistics. And today I'm going to talk to you about trying to get at the best practices in science writing by trying to convince you that the science is social, which I think that Kate and Ebony have both done a good job so far of trying to get across. And so some of the points will overlap, but I hope it's a good through line rather than redundancy. So first I want to situate who I am and what kind of context I'm bringing to this. Again, I'm at UCSB. I went to Emory University for undergrad, where I studied linguistics, anthropology, and African American studies. But before that, and one of the reasons it's really exciting for me to be talking to the DC Science Writers Association is that I'm actually from the DC area. I worked at the Smithsonian for a summer. I went to Bladensburg High School, Prince George's County Public Schools. So science and the DC area are both very, very important to me. And so that's a part of the context that I'm bringing to this, where I lean both into some of the science as well as into the kind of sociocultural linguistic that might be considered less scientific, to kind of bring them together in a way that is hopefully enlightening or illuminating. And so I want to start by framing this as a kind of hierarchy of needs, if we like Abraham Maslow and humanistic psychology. But we're kind of going to go from broader to narrow scope. I'm going to talk about the science of politics, the scoop, as it were, kind of as a journalistic frame, then framing itself, and then the writing which is kind of more specifically in terms about an inclusive language that we're here for. But I think in order to get to that, we have to background what we're thinking about as science in the first place. And so my first major point is that science is political. I hope I don't have to sell too many people on that too strongly. And Ebony discussed some of this history already, but I really want to re-emphasize that science and scientific research is nowhere separable from the social and political politics of the society that we live in. And so I have a couple examples of this, one being the discipline of phrenology, which is kind of the use of skulls and analysis of indentations on the skull to make arguments about mental capacities of individuals. Now, this had its heyday in the 18th century, like the middle and late 18th century, and it's been since seen as, disproven, obsolete, archaic, and patently racist since then. Another example, this is like the mid 19th century, where J. Marion Sims, known as the father of gynecology, developed this technique for treating vesicovaginal fistula, which is essentially a condition where a tract is formed from the urethra into the vaginal canal, which allows discharge to flow, creating all sorts of problems. But he found this cure by experimenting on Black women who were enslaved in all sorts of horrible and violent ways. And then another example more contemporarily is the development of oral contraceptives, the pill, as it were, which was tested on Puerto Rican women in poorer communities in Puerto Rico because there were less legal protections for Puerto Ricans, and the women whom the pill was tested on in its early stages, some of them died. They suffered dizziness, fainting, etc. And because of the lack of the IRB that Ebony mentioned, they were not actually required to discuss their motives with the participants. The reason why I'm bringing up all of this old and kind of historical perspective is because science is always an iterative process. So the science we have today came from the science of yesterday. The science of tomorrow will be from the science that we have today, right? And insofar as the social and political context of our society, one that was patently racist then and still is now, if you look around, right, it's still going to have an effect on the science that we produce today. So one of our goals and missions as scientists, as science writers, people who communicate science to the world and the broader public, should really be consistently investigating and engaging the ways that social and political context is affecting the scientific research that we read, write, and talk about. And so how does this affect science writers? First, I think it has to do with what kind of stories we have and how that affects what we can write about, right? And so my recommendation is thinking about what flavor is the science you're writing about, right? Is it vanilla? I'm drawing metaphors such that, is it written primarily by white people, white men in particular, white, straight, cisgender men in particular, right? And if so, harkening back to the last slide, that's going to affect the kind of science that they're producing. So if you want to have science that is engaging, or write about science that is engaging different audiences, particularly audiences that are historically marginalized, well then your scoop has to look a little differently, right? And so inclusivity in that frame means highlighting the work of scholarship coming from those groups, right? So, what are Black, brown, queer, disabled, indigenous scholars doing at NIH, at the Smithsonian? What are they publishing in Nature, right? These are the kinds of articles that you should be looking for to be able to have a sustained perspective on what is going to be relevant to our communities, right? And so in order to really reach our communities in that way, you have to be able to set the frame. That becomes much easier if there's someone from the community doing the writing. And then you set a frame in a way that is relevant to us, right? And one of those ways is by engaging that broader context. And so I'm coming up with a hypothetical example, more or less on the spot. But let's say we're talking about GMOs and the efficacy of pesticides, right? And we're, maybe writing about a paper where someone says Monsanto developed some new super effective GMO that's pesticide resistant, right? Well, we also should consider who is going to be, harvesting those crops, who, as we know historically, is going to be affected by the use of pesticides, primarily Latinx and immigrant folks who are actually doing the farming, right? And so if you actually want to be inclusive and have people or reach people who, have been traditionally marginalized, both in science but in our broader society, you have to be able to include that context in order to make it interesting and relevant. And now in terms of the language, and I think this is the last thing that I'll touch on, which is, I guess, what you really came for. The gold standard at base is going to be to listen to and pay close attention to how community members use language about other community members and our experiences, right? So are people using words like Black or African American? Is there a difference between the two in this context? If that's not clear to you, maybe do further research or ask if it's appropriate, but also be clear that it's not appropriate to ask for unremunerated labor from community members to explain to you things that are very easily Googleable. Google is very wide and very deep. And I think it's always a good suggestion to direct people there first, because we are, scholars after all. But if we can take a couple different perspectives on this, we can think about race for one, right? So one of the kind of recently debated topics is around capitalization, whether or not you should capitalize racial groups. And I have thoughts on this, but the thing that I want you all to be thinking about is that it's not just style, right? It's not just, well, am I going to use a capital letter or not? It's about what that means, what it signifies, and what it represents. And I think this is kind of broadly about points that both Ebony and Kate made, which is that there's no one size fits all kind of answer, because it's not about using this word or that word or using the right word, right? Because if that's the goal, then you're not actually really learning about the systems and therefore don't have a way of doing it. And so one of the arguments that I think it's important to afford about why people capitalize the B in Black, for instance, is one, to highlight the kind of systemic nature of racialized oppression. For me specifically, it's actually a quite literal relationship between the creation of capital and the use of capital letters, right? So such that chattel slavery meant the turning of Black bodies into literal capital to turn profit from labor. That's a really good reason why we might capitalize the B in Black as a way of keeping that history in mind. Other arguments extend to the fact that within the Black diaspora, the communities that are all descendants of slaves from Africa across the Caribbean, some in South America, there in some ways are shared and distinctive foodways, cultural practices of song, dance, literature, that sort of thing. These are two somewhat distinct arguments, both which I think have merit. But again, it's just one reason why you might capitalize Black, and one of the reasons why you might not capitalize white is because white people as a group don't share either of those histories per se. It's the idea. And the other thing is about which term you should use in one case or another. And this is why I'm hearkening to identification. And I would always advise that specificity is inclusivity, right? So recently, and I think this is where Tien saw some of my work in a Vox article where I was talking about phrases like BIPOC and people of color. BIPOC standing for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, very broad umbrella to talk about non-white peoples. And sometimes terms like that are useful. It just depends on how specific you intend to be. But even taking a more narrow case, like Black versus African American, are you talking about people who are descendants of enslaved Africans from the United States, or the area that is now the United States? If so, then you're talking about African Americans, and it might actually be useful to be that specific about what you're talking about. But sometimes you might be talking about something that is more broadly about the project of, racialization and white supremacy, something that's going to affect someone whose ancestry is from Jamaica just as much as Nigeria, right? Because there aren't Black people anywhere that are exempt from white supremacy, even though it looks different from context to context, right? So you might use more specific language, or even Afro-Latinx, right, is a phrase that you might use when you're talking about people with African ancestry in Brazil, which wouldn't necessarily be applicable in the same way to, you know, an African American in South Carolina. You get the point. So those are just kind of some considerations for how we think about and write about race. And then we can also think about gender and sexuality. And again, for each of these points, I'm just pointing out a couple things, right? There are many, 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 and I am not even close to the sole arbiter of what all of the good practices are, you know, for doing these things. But when we're thinking about gender and sexuality, one thing that I see a lot is writers assuming the pronouns of a researcher based on their first and last name. They assume that Charles is a man, when in fact, they assume that Charles is a cisgender man, but they assume that maybe this, or they don't necessarily consider the fact that Charles might be a trans woman who has not made a legal change to their name yet. But this is something that a quick Google might tell you, actually, because a lot of trans folks, researchers in particular, will actually write publicly about what name they should use, what name people writing about their work should use. And also, this is not just limited to that, but for instance, someone who changed their name on account of marriage, but changed their name to something else after a divorce, for instance, it might be less than appropriate to consider using their married name. But again, these are all things that you kind of need to look into on the basis of context. The other thing, which is less about word choice and more conceptual, that I would just love to see more science writers do, is to write more explicitly about what biological sex is as a conceptual model, as opposed to some like universal fact about the world, because of, if we're being frank, science education in the United States is very poor, and that most intelligent adults think that sex is just this biological fact about not just humans, but species in general, that species are male or female, and that's kind of the end of the deal. And people writing about science, I know a lot better than that. And I think when folks are writing about research, particularly about reproduction or sexuality, I just recently looked at a study about the differential effects of coronavirus on people according to sex. And you see words like between sexes, right? So from a linguistic sense, that implies two things. I'm sure that scientists knows that intersex people exist, right? So even like drawing dichotomies implicitly that way is problematic, and I'd love to see more science writers kind of engaging in the politics of writing about gender in that way. The last thing, which I won't say too much about because Kate covered it in a really brilliant way, but I think a lot about verb choice. We use kind of unthinkingly words like listening, speaking, talking, to just mean humans broadly, walking, again, when maybe that isn't applicable to a lot of humans, and that doesn't make them any less human, or me or you or anyone else. And we see this also very clearly with figurative language, which Kate gave some examples of. The one that comes to mind most immediately is the idea of a double-blind study, which if you take any psychology class, it's the first thing you learn in methods, right? That's just the thing you do. Or blind peer review, which is something that academics say and write about routinely today. And so that's also something we're thinking about moving toward a more inclusive language we might want to avoid or rethink. And at this point, I'm over time. So, other things, again, I'm not the sole arbiter, so there are other things to consider. Thank you for your attention. And just want to end by saying science writing can be social justice, but only if you make it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your talks, and that was really, really useful. And as DeAndre mentioned, I did see your work in that Vox article, and it actually inspired how I wanted to title this talk, which is In Conversation About Inclusive Writing, instead of a how-to, which I think you all touched on. There's there's no 1 hour seminar that's going to teach you, and you're going to be good after that. It's that people are scared to say the wrong thing, but you really need to do the research and put in the time to figure out when a term is when you should use term and how it's been used before. So with that, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I'm going to start with a couple of questions, and then I'll move to audience questions. So I thought, we could start. I wanted to start with Ebony. I was also reading another article about sensitivity readers, which and you can all answer, but a recent article in the Open Notebook about sensitivity readers, and I think that's something that people are wondering about, how to work with a sensitivity reader. And along those same lines, you were quoted in that article as saying that sensitivity readings are not meant to absolve the writer. So I thought, could you talk a little bit about what someone might expect when they're working with a sensitivity reader, and how they could set out their expectations?
Sure. Sensitivity reading is a tricky thing because a lot of people have different motivations for requesting it. And I think people really need to be honest about why they're asking. Like, a lot of people don't want to be racist or homophobic or transphobic or xenophobic or whatever, but a lot of people just don't want to be yelled at on social media when, Black Twitter comes and says things. What people should expect, what people should understand is that right now there is a very wide variety of sensitivity readers, and their work varies across the board. And so you might be expecting a lot of deep insight, and you may not get that. And so you should be clear on what you are looking for, but be open to knowing that you might miss something that the reader will find, and you should be thinking about that and taking that into consideration. And of course, no reader speaks for everyone. And so you should always hire as many sensitivity readers as your budget allows, and be prepared to make changes. You can't just hire a sensitivity reader and then go to press anyway. Like, you're wasting people's time, and Black Twitter will come for you. Just don't do it.
Did anyone else want to speak on this subject? Okay. And so following up on that, I was wondering, when you do make a misstep, or let's say an outlet makes a misstep, and this is for all of you, when a story uses harmful, insensitive to harmful language, what's a good approach to, acknowledging that harm and then also correcting the story?
I can say something about that. So it's really important in this work to learn how to apologize. And apologize is not saying, I didn't mean to. It's not saying that that's not what I intended. That is not making excuses. In order to apologize effectively, you have to admit what was wrong, offer the correction of what the right thing is, acknowledge the impact that you made on people, and learn from it, and basically do your best not to do it again. So you can't justify it because impact is always greater than intent. And just understand that you will mess up, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. You just have to be very conscious about what you're doing, and just be careful and thorough. And most people can tell when you actually are trying your best, and most people can tell when you're taking shortcuts.
I want to add also, and all of that, yes, so much. But I want to add as well that I think in an ideal world, in an ideal setting, aircraft, sorry about that if you can hear that. In an ideal world, just as the article is a collaboration between a writer and an editor, if a correction needs to be made, that's also a collaboration in an ideal world, if an editor has made a mistake and an editor has not caught it, then together they will figure out what to do, and the editor will both have the writers back and expect them to take accountability for their actions. I think that there have been examples of writers who've been hung out to dry by their editors, and there have been examples of editors who have kind of taken the fall. And I think in the dream, everybody is coming forward together to say, we missed this and we need to do better.
Thank you, Kate. And following on that, actually, I had a chance to take a sneak peek at your slides, Kate, and there were a couple of points that I wondered if you could expand on, and one of them is about sort of a narrative to avoid around disability, and I liked your title is "Disability is not an inspiration," or sorry, yes, that's the title.
So yeah, we've got another 3 hours, right? We can there's a lot to be said about this, but yes, to make it very, very brief, I strongly encourage everybody to look up the late Stella Young's TED Talk called "My Disability is Not an Inspiration" or "Your Inspiration." Thank you very much. But to make it very brief, disabled and chronically ill people do not exist to inspire everybody else. We are full-fledged human beings with our own lives. And there are a lot of different tropes that promote the idea that this concept of disabled people as very heartwarming objects. So some real quick bullet points. Great things to avoid is describing somebody as overcoming their disability. More often than not, what these people are overcoming is a world that's thrown up barriers to prevent them from succeeding. Another really common one is praising a disabled or sick person for doing something normal, like going to the prom or getting a job. We're not circus animals. It's not like, it's difficult, but it's not unthinkable for us to do these things. And to celebrate these events like they're exceptional perpetuates an idea that we're kind of novelties or that we're burdens without any agency. For me, one of the most painful types of inspiration porn is when an abled person is praised to the heavens for being a decent human being to a disabled person. And this could be going on a date with them, or just being their parent, or just being nice to them. But basic human decency is not exceptional, it's not heroic, it's not selfless. And when we act as though it is, it really, really magnifies this concept that disabled people are burdens who don't deserve that much. Then the last one should be obvious, but maybe isn't, and that's comparative gratitude, which is saying, at least you don't have it that bad, or, you know, what's your excuse? So there's, again, hours and hours that could be said about this, but again, I just encourage everybody to look up Stella Young's TED Talk, and that's a great starting point.
Thank you, Kate. And lastly, I wanted to touch on something that DeAndre, you brought up, the point about the capitalization, and that's something I had sent to you all before, about how there's a lot of outlets now who have put out statements that they're all going to capitalize Black, and there's still a lot of debate about whether or not to capitalize white. So the AP style guides says they will not, and the recommendation from the National Association of Black Journalists has recommended that groups like brown and white also be capitalized. And so I thought if you could speak on that topic, and or on any point where you feel that there isn't consensus, and how do we approach that? I know we said we're not going to give answers, but how do we think about situations that are really in flux?
Yeah, I think that's an important question to ask. I think when there is not consensus or there is disagreement, you kind of have to be an agent and make a choice, right? About, you know, which you're going to use if there are multiple options. But you also have to be responsible for that choice and make an informed one, right? So if some people are saying you should capitalize white and some people are saying you aren't, you have to do one or the other, but you should do so from an informed perspective, right? You should be able to say, well, I'm following this convention from, the Associated Press or some other organization, and here's why, right? So less than, well, the Chicago style told me to do it, therefore I did it. But maybe do a little background on how did they reach that conclusion, right? And that'll help you understand the history and the rationale, and you can decide for yourself if you agree with that rationale and if you don't. But you should at least, approach or investigate it for yourself rather than just kind of taking point. One of the things that I emphasize that this is not a just tell me the right thing to say kind of deal, right? Because that's not helpful for anyone. But you really have to kind of understand different perspectives, particularly those from the community. And one quick example I can give, I was teaching in a local high school. I'm in Santa Barbara. I was teaching in a local high school that a class that was predominantly Latinx, mostly students of Mexican cultural background. And I asked them one day, had they ever heard of the term or the phrase Latinx? And many of them were like, not really. And some nodded their heads. And I was like, okay, for those of you who have heard it, does it mean anything to you? And the vast majority of them were like, no, not really. I've heard it or seen it, but it doesn't make a difference to me. And I heard about it when I was at college in Atlanta. And so it was shocking to me because I had been taught that was the correct or appropriate way to be inclusive vis-a-vis gender. When you're talking about, Latin American folks. And it was news to me that some community members didn't agree. Some people, in fact, feel like that use actually is an academic distinction that people from the community don't actually use. So it might be classist or elitist in that sense. In the sense that community members who don't have access to a collegiate education might be shamed as transphobic or not inclusive for not having access to that language. And I only use that story to show that, these things are constantly in flux. And, now looking forward, I won't make the mistake of assuming that a group of people that I might identify as Latinx in an attempt to be inclusive gender-wise, why that might not be received by some folks or, might not be received well. And I can say, oh, well, this is why I'm doing it. And some may disagree with that. And that allows me to reflect on my positionality and maybe make some amendments if those are necessary. And I think that's what writers and all people really should be responsible for doing around these issues of language, because they are and will always be highly contentious.
Thank you. Kate, did you want?
No, I have nothing to add to that. That was great.
Okay. Wonderful. So we have a couple minutes left, and I'll move to the audience questions. So actually, Kate, this one is from Andrew. So they write, has the language you use to describe yourself and your own disabilities changed over time? And if so, what made you make these changes?
Yeah, this is a great question, especially coming on the heels of the last one. Absolutely, and it is still constantly changing. This is changing as a result of two things. First is my own personal experience of my disability, and the second is my immersion in disability culture. For a long time, I was undiagnosed. I was born with my disabilities, but I did not get diagnosed until I was almost 30. And in the interim, I felt really weird about identifying even as having a chronic illness because I wasn't sure that that's what it was. And I was experiencing the effects of it, but there's a lot of division and it can be very complicated to settle down into an identity when you're not sure about it. So I hesitated even to take that on. And then once I realized, yeah, this is here to stay, I wasn't sure about disability. And the more I learned about it, and this is kind of the immersion part, the more I thought, oh, this could apply to me. But I still felt pretty reticent about it. And like maybe it didn't belong to me until I got a diagnosis. I don't want to say that this is the only way to do it because in fact, I absolutely could have claimed that label years ago. But for me, for myself, when I found out what it was that I was living with, I was like, that's a disability. I am disabled. And I stepped into that not long after. But in terms of identity first and person first language, that's changing. In terms of, you know, how I think about illness versus disability, that's changing. And much of it has to do with being a part of the conversation in the disability community, as well as my own relationship with my body and my disabilities. So I think this is something that I've actually seen happen as a science writer with some of my sources, even that in one instance, very early on, I was feeling a little squeamish about asking somebody to self-identify. And I was like, I'll just go back and see what else they've written. And I read something that they'd written a long time ago, and I was like, I don't think that's true anymore. I'm going to have to actually be a reporter and ask them. So yeah, it's a good thing to remember that just because something is one way one day doesn't mean it's going to be that way a year from now.
Thank you. And we have one more question, if you guys don't mind, if you all don't mind. And this is from, and I believe I'm pronouncing this correct. I believe we've met, Claudia. Her question is, any suggestions on how to approach a conversation with sources about how to address them, be it for pronouns, person versus identity first language, etc.?
Sure, I can actually jump back on that. I kind of just do it as almost like a survey when I'm speaking to somebody. I say, and you know, at the very top of the interview, you know, is this still a good time? You know, how you doing today? Let me make sure that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. If you feel comfortable, what are your pronouns? And then later in the fact-checking process, if I realize that there are aspects of their identity or ways that they describe themselves that I haven't established, that I haven't heard come out of their mouths, then I'll go back to them and say, I'm doing some fact-checking. I just want to make sure, can you let me know what X is, how you use X? And when people have done that with me, I've certainly been like, yeah, I'm really glad you asked.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any advice for how to approach this type of conversation?
What I sometimes do when I'm editing someone else's work, or if I'm reviewing something, I will just make a point to say the reason why I'm asking this is because I don't want to misgender you. I don't want to misrepresent who you are. So I would like to get it correct. And on those rare occasions when I don't have, for example, someone's pronouns, I sort of move text around a little bit and I use someone's name. As long as you're using the name that they give you and not like a dead name or like a nickname that they don't approve of. Using someone's name is usually a safe way to make sure that you're still referring to someone properly.
Yeah. DeAndre, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that sometimes it's most appropriate, or I don't know, it helps to create a space where folks are more comfortable having those kinds of conversations when you offer up that information first, even if it's lower stakes for you, or if you don't even intend to ask about it. So for instance, me, as someone who, you know, identifies most closely with non-binary gender neutral pronouns, it's always an awkward moment when I'm the first person in this space to introduce pronouns. Because if pronouns go previously unmarked in the rest of the circle of introductions, then that now marks me even more so as the person who is being disruptive. You're using, as in, you know, I may be using more information in my introduction than other people use, and people will see that as weird, and maybe it's justification to attack me in so many ways, whether it's, you know, socially or what have you. So just kind of becoming more attuned to and offering up the practices from your position as someone who, if you benefit in a particular kind of way, whether it's gender or race or something like that, if you have a position that's normally unmarked in the space, then you marking it can really help, you know, other folks who actually are going to be more targeted than you are for doing so. So pronouns are one way, pronouns, gender is another way. You know, if you are, you know, cisgender, which is something that people usually don't think about because they assume that people in general are cisgender if they can't tell that you're not. So kind of changing the normalcy, right, around what we consider to be appropriate in terms of conversations, in terms of identifiers. I think that's the most important thing, and that people who are in positions of privilege within those categories should be the ones really pushing the hardest to drive that new sense of normalcy forward.
Thank you. So we're a bit over 7:30 now, and I wanted to give you all a chance to say anything that I didn't ask or that didn't come up, that if there's any last words that you wanted to say.
Okay, I have two quick things, if that's okay. First, just as science writers, if you want to be responsible, if you are offered an assignment about illness and disability, you are not ill or disabled, and you think maybe this isn't your place, maybe it's not your place, pass the mic. I think that's a really important thing that you can do. The second thing is, if you are interested in learning more about this language, I encourage you to follow as many disabled people on social media as you can, because we are talking all the time. And when you hear us in conversation about both our daily lives and the way we're changing, the way that language is changing, it makes it a lot easier to comprehend and to make it less difficult to make those mental jumps to kind of writing more inclusively.
Thank you. Okay. Well, so I will just close out and say thank you to our wonderful panelists. I learned so much, and I really appreciate all of your time. And thank you to all of our attendees for joining.